Blend modes allow you to control how the pixels on one layer work with or affect or blend with other pixels in Photoshop. They can be found throughout Photoshop, but in this video we're going to focus on changing blend modes using the Layers panel. But it might be helpful to know that blend modes are also available when you're using the painting tools. They're available in layer styles, the fill, stroke, and fade commands, even apply image and calculation commands. We're going to focus on the most commonly used blend modes rather than go into detail on all of them. Let's take a look for a moment at the two layers that I have in this document. I'm going to hide the watch layer so that we can see the beach layer below. We're going to call this bottom layer the base color, knowing that it could be made up of just a single layer or multiple layers. And we'll call this top layer, the watch layer, the blend color, because it's what we're going to blend with the base layer. This is the layer that we're going to be changing the blend mode on. And the result color is what you get as a result of applying the blend mode. The blend modes are grouped together in the list. They're separated by these thin lines. Let's start by taking a look at the first group, normal and dissolve. When the top layer, the watch layer, is set to normal, which is the default mode, none of the pixels blend. So there's no change unless you did something like change opacity, for example. For now, I'll reset that back to 100 and choose dissolve instead. Again, nothing happens at 100%. However, this time when I change the opacity for the dissolve layer, all of a sudden some pixels are randomly replaced, revealing a speckled effect, which is either the blend color, which is the layer below, or the base color. It's never a combination of the two. It's one or the other. So it creates this stippled effect where we can see some of each of the layer at 100%. I'll go ahead and return that back up to 100%, and let's take a look at this next group of blend modes. These all have stronger effects as the blend color becomes darker. So darken and multiply are the two most commonly used blend modes in this group. If we take a look at darken, darken looks at the color information in each channel and it selects the darker of the base or blend colors as the result. So we're always going to get a darker image. If I change this to multiply, multiply multiplies the base color with the blend color. So again, we're always going to get a darker color. If you multiply any color with black, you'll always get black. And multiply is a bit like sandwiching two chromes, two slides, and projecting them together, so you'll get that darker result. The blend modes in this group have what's called a neutral color of white, which means that white will have no effect. Basically, white goes away. If I set this back to normal, you can see that this outer area here, this band around the image, is white, but when I select either darken or multiply, that white disappears. The third group of blend modes here all have a stronger effects as the blend mode color becomes lighter. They're basically the inverse of the second group of blend modes. So lighten and screen are the two most commonly used from this group. If we select lighten, we can see that it's choosing the lighter of the base or the blend color as the result color. If I choose screen instead, it's actually a stronger effect because it's multiplying the inverse of the blend and base color. Again, the resulting color is always going to be lighter, and the effect here is similar to projecting multiple photographic slides onto the same screen, so the image will always get lighter. And the blend modes in this group have what is called a neutral color of black, and that means that black will simply disappear. Again, if I change this back to normal, we can see that this band here is black in the top watch file, but when I set this either to lighten or to screen, that black completely disappears. So this fourth group of blend modes all add contrast to an image because they lighten when using colors that are brighter than 50%, and they darken when they're using colors darker than 50%. And overlay and soft light are the two most commonly used blend modes in this group. If I select overlay, the blend multiplies the colors darker than 50% and it screens the colors lighter than 50%, adding a significant amount of contrast in the image. If I switch this to soft light also adds contrast to our image, but you can tell that it's a lot less than that overlay mode. Now, this fifth group of blend modes, well, they can be used for creative effects or for scientific purposes. And the sixth group of blend modes, they don't have any neutral colors, and the most common are color and luminosity. If I select color, I'm only seeing the color from the watch layer. This is very useful for coloring monochromatic images and for hand tinting images. If I select luminosity, it's the inverse of the color mode, and it can be used to suppress any color shifts when you're making adjustments to luminosity. So say, for example, you add a curves adjustment layer, sometimes the colors can shift in an image, but if you change the blend mode to luminosity, you restrict it so that the colors can't shift at all. Now, to quickly move through these different blend modes without selecting them from the list, you can use the keyboard shortcut Shift plus or Shift minus, but you need to make sure that you have one of these top tools selected that don't have a blend mode. If I were to use the shortcut right now with the paintbrush selected, it would change the blend mode for that tool. So I can select the Move tool or tap the V key and then use Shift plus in order to go down through the blend modes, or Shift minus to go back up through the blend modes. So there we go, a quick overview of the power of blend modes in Photoshop. There's a variety of different ways that you can add edge effects to your images. One of my favorite ways is to either use a scan or a photograph of torn paper. So all I've done here is I've ripped some heavy watercolor paper, and then I put it on top of the scanner with the scanner lid open, because as the light falls off between the scanner and my ceiling, there's not enough light to actually register, and so the background will just automatically go black. In order to select some of the edges, I'll choose the rectangular marquee tool and then click and drag in order to select a strip. Now I can use the Move tool by tapping the V key, and I can drag and drop this into my other image. In order to see both of these layers, I'll use Command Shift T in order to toggle them. That is a shortcut that we added in a previous movie, and then drag and drop from the image area over into the nest image. Then I no longer need the paper scan open, so we can close that. And on my layers panel, we can see that this paper image or edge has been added. I'll go ahead and rename that and then tap Return to enter it. Now I'm going to reposition this edge, and which side I put it on depends on whether I want dark edges or light edges. So for this first example, I'm going to use white edges, so I'll reposition it to the left-hand side. Now I need to make a duplicate of that, so I'll use Command J, and then I'll free transform that duplicate that's sitting right on top of the original by right mouse clicking and choosing to flip this horizontally. Then I'll reposition it over to the right-hand side and tap Return or Enter in order to apply that transformation. I now need to duplicate both of these layers, so I'll select them both on the Layers panel by holding down the Command key and clicking on the second edge. And then I'll use Command J to duplicate both of those. I'll use Command T in order to free transform, and then with my cursor positioned outside of the transformation handles, I'll rotate, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and that will constrain it so that when it gets to 90 degrees, it will snap. I'll go ahead and release my cursor and apply that transformation. But we can't see those edges because when I rotated it, it rotated it outside of the visible image area. Well, I know based on the position of the lower two layers that when I transform this, the edge copy 2 is going to be up above my image. So with the Move tool selected, I will click and drag down until I reveal that edge. Then I'll position it or snap it right there to the top. And I'll do the opposite with edge copy 3. It needs to be moved up, so I'll click and drag up until it's visible. Now, in order to remove the black edges so that I only see the white edges, I'll select all of the layers in my Layers panel and then change the blend mode to Screen. If I wanted the opposite, if I wanted dark edges instead of light edges, well, I could undo what we just did, so Command Z. And then I need to invert each one of these layers. So I'll select the edge layer and then choose Image, Adjustments, Invert. And we can see that the keyboard shortcut for that is Command I. So I'll select the next layer and use Command I, the next layer, Command I, and one more time, Command I. Now that they're all inverted so that black is along the edge and white is on the inside, I'll select all of the layers and then use the blend mode, multiply, in order to get black edges. And there you have it, a very simple way to add unique edges to your images. One way to emulate an image transfer is by using a scan of an image transfer done the traditional way. In order to view both of the images I have open, I'll use Shift-Command-T to tile them, which is a keyboard shortcut I set up in a previous movie. And now I want to make sure that I take the edge scan and drag and drop it into the magnolia. And the reason that I want to do it that way is because the edge scan is in grayscale. If I drag the magnolia on top of this file of the edges, it will convert the magnolia image to grayscale. So I will click on the edge scan to make it the active document, and from the layers panel, I'll select the background and drag and drop it on top of the magnolia. Then I no longer need the edge scan, so I'll close that and tap the F key to go to full screen mode. Now, because I want these edges to be superimposed on top of the magnolia, I'm going to change the blend mode for the edges to multiply. However, when I do that, obviously we can still see the original photograph, and I'm getting the semi-transparency around the edges. The first thing that we'll do is we'll remove this inner area of the photograph so that we can just see the magnolia. In order to do that, I'll select the polygonal lasso tool, and I'll click in the upper left where the photograph stops and this edge begins. Then I'll click in the upper right, down at the lower right, lower left, and then I can double click in order to close that selection. Now on layer 1, if I add the mask icon, it's going to only show what's inside the selection, and what I want to show is outside of the selection, so I'll hold down the Option key and then click on the mask, which will give me an inverted mask. The edge of the mask is a little bit too sharp, so on the Properties panel, I'll use the feather slider in order to soften up that edge. And I'm going to be rather generous here because I do want a nice soft fuzzy edge there. Then, in order to make this outer area completely opaque, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. The easiest way to do this is either use the keyboard shortcut Command J or drag the layer down to the new layer icon in order to duplicate it. This layer, I'm going to change the blend mode back to normal. But I do want a semi-transparent area right around here in these dark edges. So I'll select my brush tool, make sure that I'm painting with black because I want to hide the opaque areas. My opacity is set to 100% and make sure that my mask is targeted in the layers panel. But did you notice what happened when I targeted the mask as opposed to the image? If you look at my foreground and background color, when the image is selected, black is my foreground color, but when the mask is selected, it switched to white. So I need to tap the X key to make sure that black is the foreground color, and then I'll click once in the upper left here, hold down the Shift key and click again, hold down the Shift key again and click in the lower right, again in the lower left, and then one more time back here at the top. So if I hide this middle layer, this edge layer, you can see that what I've done is I've got a layer here at the top that is 100% in normal blend mode. So we're seeing the white edge here. In the layer below, layer 1 that's set to multiply, I'm getting this nice semi-transparent or semi-opaque area, which is showing these edges. The one last thing that I might want to do in order to make this image look more realistic is convert the background into a smart object and then add a smart filter. So I'll right mouse click on the background layer and convert it to a smart object. I'll tap the D key to make sure that my default colors are black as my foreground and white as the background. And then I'll choose Filter, Filter Gallery, and in Filter Gallery, I want to select the Distort menu and Diffuse Glow. Then to view the entire image, I'll use the pop-up menu and select Fit on Screen. I can increase the grayness amount and lower the glow amount, as well as lower the clear amount. But this will just add a little bit of noise as well as a little bit of a glow to the image, making it look a little bit more antique and not quite as perfect as a straight photograph. So there you go, an easy way to use blend modes to emulate an image transfer effect. Blend modes and opacity are the key to adding textures and grunge on top of a photograph. Here, I want to view both of my images, so I'll choose Command-Shift-T in order to toggle them, which is a custom keyboard shortcut that I set up in a previous movie. Then I'll tap the V key to select my Move tool, and with the texture image selected, I'll drag the background from the Layers panel and drop it on top of the hydrangea, holding down the Shift key to get it to drop right in the center. Then we can close that texture image, and I'll tap the F key to go to full screen mode. In order to quickly view all of the different blend modes, I'll tap the V key to make sure that I have the Move tool selected, and then use the keyboard shortcut Shift+ in order to move down through the blend modes. I like this multiply blend mode, but let's keep looking at other ones. There's color burn, linear, and on down through the different options. Kind of liked that screen blend mode. Overlay looks really nice. Soft light looks good too. And in fact, I really like hard light. So you can see how using this keyboard shortcut can quickly show us a lot of different variations and all of the different effects that we could achieve just by changing the blend modes. All right, I'm back to normal, but I think what I liked the best was probably this multiply. And it's very obvious that I've applied it. But what I don't like is I don't like the amount of color that I'm seeing from the texture layer here, this top layer. So I'm going to quickly desaturate that by using Image, Adjustments, and then Hue and Saturation. Now, this is a permanent change that I'm making, but I'm confident that I want to remove a significant amount of that color tinting that I'm getting from the color in layer 1. So I'm going to decrease the saturation to -30 and click OK. I like the texture, but I might want to back off on it a little bit, so I'm going to tap the 8 key to give me 80% opacity. Maybe I'll try the 6 key to give me 60%, but I think I like it better up towards 8, so I'll tap 8 again. Now, I really like the texture in the background, but I don't necessarily want the texture over the hydrangea, and I would like to just screen it back a little bit over the glass vase. In order to do this in the most flexible way, I'm going to convert layer 1 to a smart object by right mouse clicking on it and then choosing Convert to Smart Object. Once I convert it to a smart object, then I can add a smart filter by going under the Filter menu, choosing Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. I'll add a Gaussian blur in order to blur this texture so that I no longer see it over the hydrangea area. Now it's also blurring the rest of the image, but I'm going to take care of that in a moment. When I click OK, we can see that because I converted this layer to a smart object, when I added the filter, I got a smart filter. And a smart filter can have its own mask. Right now, the mask for the filter is white, so I'm seeing the blur throughout the entire image. If I click on the smart filter mask and then choose Edit Fill and fill it with my foreground color, which is black, if it wasn't black, I could select black from the menu, but I'll fill it with my foreground color at 100%. Now I'm hiding the blur, because wherever the mask is black, it hides what it's associated with, and here it's not hiding the layer, it's hiding the blur. But now I can select my paintbrush by tapping the B key. I'll get a little bit larger brush by holding Option, Command, and dragging to the right. And I'll exchange my foreground and background color by tapping the X key so that I'm painting with white. I want to paint with about 50% opacity, so I'll tap the 5 key, and then I'll paint over the hydrangea or over the petal areas. I might paint once or twice in order to build up the blurring of that texture. Then I'll go ahead and paint once, keeping my mouse down over the entire bottle area. And if I option click on the mask, you can see that where my mask is white, I'm revealing the blur, and where it's semi-transparent here in the gray area, it's showing just a little bit of the blur, kind of hiding that texture. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't just erase or use a layer mask on layer 1 where I didn't want to see the texture. Had I used a layer mask, I would have hidden not only the texture, but also the color, and it would have been very obvious that I had a texture in some area, but not in other areas. By converting the layer to a smart object and adding the Gaussian blur, that allows me to blur those areas and then selectively show and reveal the blur so that I get the same color tint over the entire image from the texture. I just don't get the detailed texture in the areas that I don't want it. One of the easiest ways to hand tint a photograph would be to use a fill layer. Now, before I add the fill layer, I need to select the area that I want to fill. So I'll start with the Quick Select tool and select the pear on the left. I'm just dragging over the pear with the Quick Select tool. You can see that it is smart in what it selects. If it misses an area, I can simply click and drag over that area in order to add it. And if it selects too much of an area, then I can hold down the Option key in order to remove a little bit of area from the selection. So I'm just going to refine the edge here. And when I have the selection that I want, I'll choose Layer, New Fill Layer, and then Solid Color. I need to make sure that I change the blend mode, otherwise I'm just going to get a solid color of yellow or green or whatever I choose. So I'll change this to color, and I'm going to name this Left Pear. I'll click OK, and then I get to select my color. I'll move over into the red area, but I want to shift it more towards a yellow, almost a green color, and I'll take out a lot of that saturation. When I get it the way I like, we'll click OK, and we can see on my Layers panel, I have a new type of layer. This is a solid color fill layer. I have the mask that was created automatically from my selection on the right, and I've got the solid color on the left. The nice thing about using the solid color fill layers is if I want to change the color at any time, I can double click on it. That brings up the color picker, and I can shift the color, the hue, the saturation, and the brightness. I'll go ahead and click OK, but I can see the hard edges of the mask, so I'm going to go to the Properties panel and then make sure that the mask is selected so that I can use the feather slider to just soften up that edge a little bit. The other thing that I might want to do is add a second copy of this color fill adjustment layer and adjust the mask to make it look a little bit more realistic. So in order to duplicate this, I'll use the keyboard shortcut Command J, and then I'll select a different color by double clicking on the color swatch and moving it maybe a little bit darker and a little bit more towards green. Then I'll click OK. And now I just need to paint in the mask in order to hide this from maybe the right-hand side. So I'll select my brush. I've got a very large brush. I've set the opacity here to 50%, and I'll make sure that I'm painting with black. So I'll tap the X key, and then I'm just going to paint in this area here in order to hide the green and reveal some of that yellow below. Now, I think those colors are a little bit too different from one another, so I'm going to double click on the green and select a color that's a little bit closer to this yellow. So I position my cursor in the image area and clicked with the eyedropper. Select that same color, but let's make it just a little bit darker and maybe add a little bit of saturation and shift it a little bit towards red. We'll click OK, and we can see how those two colors blend together, making it look a little bit more realistic. The other way that I could colorize the pear would be to add a gradient fill layer. So I'll select the background and then go back to the Quick Select tool and click and drag in order to select the pear on the right. If it selects too much, I need to hold down the Option key and then deselect that outer area. Now sometimes when the colors are too close around the edge and Quick Select has a difficult time selecting them, it might be easier to just go in with a lasso tool and refine it. So I'll tap the L key and then hold down the Shift key so that I can add to my selection. And I don't have to start right here where I need to add it. Sometimes it's easier if you start drawing your selection and then you can more smoothly select the area that you need to. Here I need to select the tip of this, so I will add that. I need to add this area right here, so I'll select that. Again, I have the Shift key held down so that I can add to this selection. If I select too much, I can hold down the Option key like I need to right here, so I'll switch to the Option key. I'll start my selection out here and then just drag down the stem and come back over here and end my selection to subtract that from it. And there's one other area right up here at the top that I also need to subtract. All right, then I'll choose Layer, New Fill Layer, and this time I'll select Gradient. I need to change the mode to Color. I'll call this Pair Right and click OK. Now by default, it's coming up with a black to white gradient, but I can select from a number of presets by clicking on the downward pointing arrow. I can select any of these, or we can create our own. I think I'll start with this gradient here, and then in order to customize it, I'll click inside the gradient swatch, and we have 3 different stops down here at the bottom. Let's move this out of the way so we can see our pair. And to change one of these colors, I just double click on the stop. And then from the color picker, I'm going to desaturate it a little bit. I'll click OK. And I'm actually going to remove the middle stop by clicking and dragging it away from that color bar. Then I'll double click on the last stop on the right in order to change its color. I might make it a little bit darker and also move it a little bit more towards yellow so that the top of the pear is more yellow and the bottom of the pear is a little bit redder. Once I adjust that the way I like them, I'll click OK, click OK again, and one more time. Now I can see the hard edge here, so I'll return back to the Properties panel, making sure that the mask is selected, and add a little bit of a feather to that mask. The other thing that I want to do is I want to remove the color from the stem. So with the mask selected, I'll tap B to access my paintbrush. I'll get a little smaller of a brush using the left bracket key, and making sure that I'm painting with black, I'm just going to paint this out. But we can see my opacity is only set to 50%, so I'll tap the 0 key in order to set it to 100%, and then paint right there in the stem to remove the color. Of course, you don't have to make selections before you add either the solid color or the gradient fill layer. You can always just paint with a brush if you want to be more loose with the effect. Either way, now you know a quick and easy way to create a hand-painted image in Photoshop. A really quick and easy way to add a color wash over an image is to add a new gradient fill layer. From the Layer menu, I'll select New Fill Layer and then choose Gradient. I'll change the blend mode to color and then click OK. In the gradient fill dialog, I'll need to either select a gradient from the list, and although these are the default gradients, if we click on the gear icon, you'll notice that there are a number of other gradients that you can load. But for now, I'll click inside the gradient here in order to create my own custom gradient. I'll double click on the black swatch here and choose a very desaturated blue color for one of my color stops. And then I'll double click on the color swatch on the right, and I'll use a yellow color, again rather desaturated, and click OK. Although I'm not seeing that yellow color in my image area, and that's because this initial gradient that I had selected went from black to transparency. So I'm going to click the swatch up here that controls the transparency, and I will change my opacity up to 100%. So now we can see that I'm going from blue to yellow. If I think I'm going to use this again, I could click New in order to save my gradient. I'll click OK. And then in the gradient fill options, I'm going to change the angle of this gradient a little bit. If I leave the angle so that the color goes directly from one to another, from the top to the bottom of my image, my eye is just going to follow that color and it tends to fall off the bottom of the image. So I'm going to put this one at an angle, click OK, and now I'm going to create a copy of this by using Command J in order to create a copy. And I want to edit the gradient, so I'll double click on it. I'm going to click in the actual gradient here. That brings up my gradient editor again. And I'm going to make slight changes to both of my colors. So I'm going to push this a little bit more towards purple. And I'm going to double click on the stop here and push this a little bit more towards red. I'm also going to add a little bit of saturation to that and then click OK. Again, if I wanted to save this and use it again later, I could click New, and I might even want to name it beforehand, but for now we'll click New and then OK, and I'm going to set the angle for this gradient to be a little bit different. We could also change the style of the gradient if we wanted to, but I'm going to leave it to linear. Now, this top gradient fill is completely hiding all of the colors underneath it because the opacity is set to 100%. But on the Layers panel, I can decrease that opacity, so now I'm seeing part of the gradient fill layer on top and part of the second gradient fill layer down below. If I wanted to reveal some of the original colors, I would also need to decrease the opacity for that gradient fill layer. So you can see how now I'm adding a color wash using two gradient fill adjustment layers, which are set at different angles so that your eye doesn't just travel right directly down the image. And of course, I could always go in and mask out even more of this color wash in areas that I didn't want it by tapping the B key to select my brush tool, using Option and Control in order to get a larger brush. I'll tap the 5 key to decrease the opacity, and because I'm painting with black in this first gradient fill adjustment layer, you can see that I'm hiding the color wash from the petals. Then I'll move down to the next gradient fill, do the same thing, recovering some of that color from my original by hiding the two gradient fill adjustment layers. So there you have it. It's as easy as that to create a color wash in select areas of an image. Adjustment layers are an excellent way to make non-destructive adjustments in Photoshop. Now, I always try to make as many corrections to my images as I can using Adobe Camera Raw or using Lightroom before I bring them into Photoshop. However, sometimes I feel that it's easier to make my complicated and complex selections in Photoshop using the many tools available and then adding my refinements to those areas using adjustment layers. In addition, when you use adjustment layers in Photoshop, you can use them in conjunction with other features such as blend modes and opacity. In order to add an adjustment layer, you can select the Layer menu and choose New Adjustment Layer and select them from the list, or from the bottom of the Layers panel, you could select the adjustment layer icon and then select from that list. I want to make sure that we don't confuse them with the options under Image Adjustments. All of these adjustments are permanent adjustments, meaning that if I apply one of them to my image and then save the image, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for me to undo those adjustments. So I'm going to stay away from the Image menu, and instead I'll select Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'll add a Hue Saturation Adjustment Layer to this image. I can name it if I want to, and then click OK. When you add an adjustment layer, the Properties panel will automatically be displayed in order to show you all of the different options for that adjustment. In this case, I'm going to make a change to the hue, just moving it around to the left. Then at the bottom, if I want to toggle on and off the effects of this adjustment layer, I can click and hold on the icon to turn it off, and when I release the mouse, it will toggle it back on. If I ever want to reset the adjustment, I can click on this arrow to the right, and if I want to toggle on and off the adjustment on the Layers panel, I can actually do so clicking on the eye icon here on the Properties panel to hide it, and then click again in order to view it. Some adjustment layers have presets, and you can select any of these from the list. The nice thing about them is that you can then see how to change the adjustments in order to apply that effect. So here we have a great cyanotype effect and a sepia tone effect. Then we can always refine those. So for example, I could decrease the amount of saturation and maybe change the hue a little bit. If I like these settings and I want to save them for later so that I can apply them to different files, I can use the flyout menu in the upper right and save this as a preset. I'll call this JK Sepia and then just save it in the default location and click Save. We can see on the Layers panel that we have a mask automatically added to an adjustment layer. If I tap the G key to select the gradient tool and the D key to set my default colors from white to black, if I click and drag with a linear gradient over my image, you can see that I can selectively hide and show the adjustment layer. In addition, I could change the opacity of the adjustment layer using the opacity slider on the Layers panel. I could add multiple adjustment layers. If I didn't want this anymore, I could tap the Delete key in order to delete the adjustment layer, or I could save the image, and if I change my mind at any point in time, when I reopen the image, the adjustment layer will be there, and I could make changes to it. I could update it or refine it, or throw it away at any time. I could even change the blend mode of the adjustment layer. So I think you can see that adjustment layers, because they're non-destructive and because you can go back and re-edit them at any time, they're much more powerful than using the destructive edits under the image menu. So stay away from those and use the adjustment layers instead. In a perfect world, in order to maintain the highest quality image possible, I would start with a RAW file and then do as many edits as I could in Camera Raw. Then I'd open the file as a smart object into Photoshop. This would give me the most amount of flexibility when making changes. However, for a number of reasons, this workflow isn't always possible or practical, including times when the file size becomes too large to work with multiple smart objects, or the image didn't start off as a RAW file, or maybe it's already been opened and worked on in Photoshop as a pixel-based or rasterized layer. And maybe the desired selection that I want to make is easier to make in Photoshop than it is in Camera Raw. So when any of these things happen, I can make flexible edits to my layers or multiple layers using adjustment layers in Photoshop. These adjustments can affect the entire image or only a small portion. In this example, I'm going to make a global change first and then a local one. In order to add a levels adjustment layer, I'll select Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and then Levels. I can name this Overall Adjustment and tap OK. And in the Properties panel, we can see the histogram of this image. So the histogram is just a visual representation of all of the pixel values in my photograph. And we can see that it's very light in the dark areas as well as in my highlight areas over here on the right. If I start moving the black point slider over to the right, you'll notice that I am adding contrast to my image. However, if I move it too far, everything to the left of this arrow will be clipped to pure black. So I might want to back off a little bit. Then I can make a conscientious decision whether or not I want to push areas of shadow to pure black. If I want to see what areas I'm pushing to black, I can hold down the Option key and then drag the slider. So for instance, if I don't feel it's important to see any information inside this window or down here in the lower right in that shadow area, then I can go ahead and leave the black point slider here. If it's important to see detail, I'll hold down the Option key again and drag until I don't see any of those areas being clipped on screen. Now I'm going to do the same thing with a white point slider, holding down the Option key and dragging over to the left. In this case, I don't want to clip any of these values to pure white, so I'm going to make sure that I back off so that my white point falls right underneath those first pixels in the histogram. I can also use the midpoint slider. Dragging it to the left is going to lighten the image. Dragging it to the right is going to darken down the image. If I want to preview a before and after, I can click and hold on the eye icon. That's before, and there's after. I like this adjustment, but I want to make an additional adjustment to this area here that has the logo. I'll select the polygonal lasso tool from my toolbar. I'll click once in the top area, then click again at the point, again down here where the bottom point would be, on the left-hand side, and then back at the top. Now I want to add a secondary adjustment layer, but this time I'll add it from the bottom of the layers panel. I'll add another levels adjustment layer. We can see that the histogram looks a little bit different because the histogram is only showing me what was inside of that selection. Now those marching ants have disappeared because Photoshop automatically converted the selection into a mask, and we can see that mask on my layers panel. In fact, if we wanted to see the mask, we could option click and view the mask in the image area. I'll click the eye icon in order to see the image. And I want to return back to the levels adjustment, but right now all I can see is the information for the mask. So to the left of the mask highlight here, I'm going to click on the levels icon so that I can get the options to change. I'd like to make this area a little bit darker, so I'm going to use this mid-tone slider and move it over to the right. And you can see that only the area within that selection is being affected. Now, if I close the Properties panel and we zoom in to 100% using the keyboard shortcut Command 1, we might notice that there's a hard edge around the area that's been changed. In order to soften that edge, I'm going to double-click on the mask in the Layers panel, and I'm going to increase the feather on the mask to just give that a little bit softer of an edge. And in fact, if we option click on the mask, we can see here's the mask with the soft edge feather. If we remove that, we can see that there we have the hard edge. So the softer edge is just going to make it more difficult for anyone to tell what area has been adjusted and what area has not. Click on the eye icon in order to toggle back the visibility of that layer. So there you go, an easy way to make changes not only to an entire image, but also to a select portion of an image using adjustment layers in Photoshop. One of the most powerful adjustment layers is the curves adjustment layers in Photoshop. I want it to affect only the vault door here, so I'll make a quick selection using the elliptical marquee tool. If I want to select from the center, I'll hold down the Option key and then click in order to drag out the circular selection. If I hold down the Shift key, this will constrain it to a circle, but this might not be an exact circle, so I'll let go of the Shift key and just get it approximate. Now I didn't start quite high enough, so before I release the cursor, I'm going to hold down the spacebar and just move up the selection until it's at the top of the door. Then I'll release the spacebar and then just draw that a little larger. If you don't quite get the correct selection, you can always go into the Select menu and then choose Transform Selection. Transforming the selection will only transform the marching ants, not the pixels underneath. Once we have the selection, from the bottom of the Layers panel, I'll click on the Adjustment Layer icon and then choose Curves. Curves is very similar to levels, but you can control the midtones with more precision. Like we saw with levels, you can set your black point using the black point slider, and you could set a white point using the white point slider. I'll go ahead and undo both of those, and let's concentrate on the midtones of the image. So in levels, there was only one other triangle that you could move to adjust the midtones. In curves, you can add up to 16 different points along this curve to isolate and adjust different areas of your image. In this case, I want to delete some of these points, so I'll click and just drag them off of the curve. I want to add a little bit of contrast to this image, so I'll click and drag down in the shadow areas, but then I will click and drag up in the highlight areas, adding a lot of contrast to that selected area. One thing you do want to be careful of is as you add contrast in one area, you might be taking it away from another area. So just be a little careful if you are doing a global adjustment to the entire image that you're not creating flat areas of contrast in areas that you might not have on screen. All right, I think I took that a little too far in my shadows, so I'm going to lift them up just a little bit to make sure that we still see detail in this area of the door. Now, when I close the Properties panel, we can see that selection that we made. We see that hard edge, not only around the door, but also around this area where we haven't selected. So in order to modify this mask, I'm going to tap the B key to select my paintbrush, and I'm going to make sure that I have a hard edge brush. I'll hold down Option and Control, and then click, and you'll notice if I drag up, I get a soft edge brush, but if I click and drag down, I'll get a harder edge brush. Now I want to make sure that I'm painting with white because I'm adding to my selection. I want the adjustment layer to show in this area, so I'm going to click and paint over the entire door area here. And you can see in the mask where I've painted, I'm adding white, so I am seeing the effects of that adjustment layer. And I'll just quickly paint in this area as well. If I want to see if I've missed anywhere, I can hold down the Option key and click on the mask in order to see it. Sure enough, I've missed those two areas, so I'll paint over that with white, and then click the eye icon to view the image again. But there is still a hard edge, so I will double click on the mask for the Curves adjustment layer. That brings up the Properties panel, where I can use the feather slider in order to just soften the edge a little bit. Now I want to quickly desaturate everything that's not the door of the vault. And since I've already spent the time selecting the vault door, I can just Command click on the mask icon in the Layers panel, and that will load up that mask as a selection. Then under the Select menu, I'll select Inverse. That selects the background area, and I'll add a secondary adjustment layer by clicking on the adjustment layer icon and choosing black and white. This converts everything that I have selected to black and white. If I think that the effect is too strong, I can use the opacity slider on the Layers panel in order to decrease the opacity of the black and white adjustment so that I can see a little bit of color in the background. So as you can see, making changes to images is easy and flexible using multiple adjustment layers in Photoshop. In an ideal world, I would have removed any color cast from my image in Camera Raw, but it's really nice to know that you can address the problem in Photoshop. If we select the Image menu, you'll notice that there are a number of features to auto tone, to change auto contrast, and change auto color. But all of these are destructive edits, and I would like to make a non-destructive edit. However, when I go to the Layer menu and I choose New Adjustment Layer, I don't see all of those auto options. But you can access them in either the Curves or the Levels adjustment layer. I'll select Curves. I'll name this Color Correct. Click OK. And now in the Properties panel, you'll notice to the right there's an Auto button. If I click on that Auto button, Photoshop will try to automatically correct my image. But there are additional features if I hold down the Option key and then click on the Auto button. In fact, the Auto Color Correction options are the same ones that we just saw, plus more. Here, the first one, this is Auto Contrast, this is Auto Tone, and this is Auto Color. And we can quickly move from one to another to see which one we prefer. So when I select the first one, I like it, but it hasn't removed the color cast. If I come down to Snap Neutral Midtones, well, I don't like that at all, so let's try the Enhance Per Channel Contrast. That's more what I was after. Not only is it adding a little bit of contrast, but it's also removing that color cast. Let's just check what Find Dark and Light Colors does. That color cast is back, so I don't want that. And then the Enhance Brightness and Contrast, well, it did give the image more contrast, but there's no option to snap those neutral midtones, so it's not removing the color cast. So in this case, I prefer the Enhance Per Channel Contrast with the Snap Neutral Midtones. If I find that I'm using this combination more than any of the others, I could click to save this as my new default. Then when I click OK and I'm working on another image, when I simply click the Auto button, it would choose that preferred algorithm. So here it is before with the color cast and after. As you can see, with all of those choices, you have a really quick way to correct a color cast in images. In this image, I want to add some vibrance or some saturation to the shoe, but I don't want to add it to the rest of the image. So I need to quickly select the shoe. And the way I'm going to do that is using the lasso tool. I'm going to start in the sky area here, and I'm going to drag my marquee around the shoe. And then I am going to be a little bit careful right here where the post is. I don't want that selected, so I'm going to trace around that. And then I'll go ahead and just make my loose selection around the sky. And you might be wondering why I wasn't more careful with my selection. Well, the reason is that I know that that blue tone is rather similar all the way around the shoe. So I'm going to select the magic wand tool, which selects based on color, hold down the Option key, which removes whatever color I click on, and then I'll click in this blue area in order to remove it. Now, it missed a few areas, but I can click down here again. I'm holding down the minus key in order to subtract those colors from my selection. And I need to click once more right here inside the middle in order to remove that blue as well. So quickly we have the entire shoe selected. Now, there are a number of different ways that we can add vibrance or saturation in Photoshop. The first way that you might think of adding it is with an adjustment layer, and more specifically the hue saturation adjustment layer. But I want you to know that the saturation slider here, you can go way overboard with it. And I think there are other ways that we can add saturation that are a little bit more controllable. So let's compare this. I'm going to close the Properties panel for a moment, and I want to reuse that selection that we just created. So I'll hold down the Command key and then click inside of the layer mask. That will load it as a selection again. I'll toggle off the visibility of the hue saturation adjustment layer, and from the bottom of the Layers panel, I'll select Vibrance. Now, there are two options with the Vibrance adjustment layer. There's Vibrance and Saturation. And while the Saturation slider also can add what I feel is an overwhelming amount of saturation, it's not as much as you can add in hue saturation. So this is a little bit of a bias slider. It's not the same as it is in Camera Raw. It is different, it is unique to Photoshop, and although it does add a lot of saturation, it doesn't add as much as the hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm going to reset that back to 0 by just tapping the 0 key, and then I'm going to add in a little bit of vibrance using the Vibrance slider. You'll notice when I move this over, it's a lot gentler way to add vibrance. And in fact, if I wanted to desaturate the shoe, I would use the Vibrance slider as well in order to remove any extra color that was unwanted. But for now, I'll go ahead and add a little bit of vibrance. Close the Properties panel, and I don't think we need the hue saturation adjustment layer anymore, so I'll select it and then tap the Delete key. So there you go, a great example of using the powerful selection tools in Photoshop to either increase or decrease the saturation in your image. When people want to change a color in a photograph, I think that their first instinct is to select one of the selection tools to select that color to make the adjustment. But in fact, there's a much easier way to do this, and that's with the hue saturation adjustment layer. The bottom of the Layers panel, I'll click on the adjustment layer icon and then choose Hue and Saturation. If I want to change all of the values at once, I can simply move the hue slider or the saturation slider, or even change the tonality with the lightness slider. The reason that all of the colors are changing is because I have it set to the master. Let's reset that, and instead, from the drop-down menu, I'm going to select a specific color range, in this case yellows. As soon as I select a color range, we can see down here between the double rainbows that I have an area here that's lighter gray. This is the area that's going to be affected 100%. And the area to the left and to the right, those areas are the fade-off range because you don't want to get a harsh transition between the color that's changed and what's not. So let's go ahead and make the change to the yellow. I'm going to desaturate it 100% so that we can see exactly what's happening. If I wanted to move or adjust the color range that's being affected, I can move it completely by clicking in the lighter gray area here, If I slide this over to the left, you can see now that I've moved it, I've repositioned it under the reds so that the reds in the image are changing and the yellows are no longer changing. If I wanted to adjust both the reds and the yellows, then I can click in the fade range and drag to the right until it covers both the yellows and the reds and they're both being converted to grayscale. So now that we know how this panel works, let's reset it one more time. And now I can use our targeted adjustment tool or the scrubby slider here. Wherever I click with the eyedropper and then drag left or right, it will desaturate or saturate that color. So for example, if I wanted to desaturate the yellow, I'll click in the yellow and click to the left in order to desaturate it, or click and drag to the right in order to saturate it. I prefer it a little bit desaturated, so let's drag that almost all the way to the left. And then if I wanted to change the hue of a different color range, say for example the reds, I could hold down the Command key and then click and drag to the right to move the hue more towards orange, or click and drag to the left in order to rotate it more towards magenta. So there you have it, a very easy way to make changes to different color ranges without ever having to make a selection in Photoshop. There's another powerful way to make adjustments to your images in Photoshop, and that's using the Selective Color Adjustment layer. I'll add it by clicking on the Adjustment Layer icon at the bottom of the Layers panel. And you can see that it looks very similar to hue saturation, but there's a subtle difference. When you adjust colors using selective colors, you're using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Another difference is that you're unable to change or modify the color range that you're working with. So although it might seem more limited, if you understand color theory, you might find it much easier to use CMYK to make your changes. So to make the red appear as if it actually has more detail in it, I'll select the reds and then I'm going to add in cyan. And when I add in cyan, it's actually removing the red. And you can see, like in this area of the blanket, that it actually appears to have more detail by removing the red. I'm also going to change the green color range here. I'm going to add in some magenta, which actually removes the green, and it appears that I have more detail in the green area down here. If we want to preview this before and after, I can hold down this icon. There's before and there's after. And you're not just limited to moving colors around the color wheel, you're actually using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black to mix the colors. You can mix them in a relative manner, or if you want a stronger adjustment, you can click on absolute. For now, we'll stick with relative. The other really powerful advantage to selective color is the ability to choose your whites, neutrals, or your blacks. I'm going to remove this kind of little bit of a yellow color cast and cool down my image by selecting the whites, and then I'm going to decrease the amount of yellow and just increase a little bit of cyan. Now when I toggle this on and off, we can see that not only did those colors change, but if you look at the highlight area, it's becoming a little bit cooler. So there you go, another great way to modify portions of your image based on color or your shadows, midtones, or highlights. There are a number of different ways that you can convert your images to black and white. You can always use Camera Raw, but you can also use the Channel Mixer adjustment layer or the black and white adjustment layer in Photoshop and then customize that conversion with masking, opacity, and blend modes. From the bottom of the Layers panel, I'm going to select the black and white adjustment layer, and this adjustment layer has a number of interesting presets that you can choose from. For example, the blue filter, or maybe the green filter. There's an infrared filter, and also a red filter. Now, if you don't like any of the results here, we can always click to reset this. Then I can customize the way that any of these color ranges are converted to black and white by either using the sliders, moving them to the left or moving them to the right, or I can use the targeted adjustment tool. I'll select it and then click in my image area, If I click and drag to the left, it'll darken down that color range. If I click and drag to the right, it will lighten it. So I'll choose to lighten the rocks and then hide the properties panel so that I can access this blue sky area. Click and drag to the left in order to darken that down. Now, if I wanted to customize this further, we could always lower the opacity of the black and white adjustment layer, revealing some of the color underneath. Or I could tap the G key in order to select my gradient, tap the D key in order to set my default black and white colors, and then click and drag a gradient over my image to slowly transition from the original color image to the black and white adjustment layer. So there you have it, a great alternative to converting your images to black and white, one that gives you more power over what you want to do with the way that the colors are converted, as well as how you want to mask that conversion.